It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of Tuesday that felt like it had been mailed in by someone who didn't care much for Tuesdays in the first place. I was sitting at my desk, staring at a spreadsheet that refused to balance itself, eating what could generously be described as a salad, but was mostly croutons and regret. And then my phone buzzed. At first, I thought it was Patrick asking what I wanted for dinner. Maybe he'd finally agree to sushi instead of his usual insistence on barbecue. But when I unlocked my phone, the message I saw wasn't about dinner. I want a divorce. It's over. I stared at the screen, blinking like a malfunctioning robot. My first thought was that it was a joke, one of Patrick's lame attempts at humor. He had a history of thinking he was funnier than he was. My second thought was that he'd accidentally sent the message to the wrong person. But when I called him, the line went straight to voicemail. That's when the panic started creeping in. I opened our joint banking app, partly to distract myself, partly out of some instinct I didn't yet understand. The loading screen took forever, each spinning circle feeling like an eternity. When the balance finally appeared, my breath caught in my throat. $0. $0.00. Every penny gone. The emergency fund we'd built together, the money we'd saved for a vacation, even my half of the rent payment, all vanished. My fingers shook as I refreshed the screen, hoping it was a glitch. It wasn't. I stood up so quickly my chair tipped over, earning me a glare from my boss. Not that I cared. I grabbed my bag, muttering something about a family emergency, and bolted out of the office. In the elevator, I tried calling Patrick again, but this time the automated voice told me I'd been blocked. Blocked. By my own husband. By the time I reached the parking lot, the full weight of what had just happened hit me. Patrick hadn't just ended our marriage, he'd done it with the efficiency of a corporate layoff. A single text message, followed by erasing me financially. I sat in my car, staring at the dashboard, feeling like the floor had dropped out from under me. How could he do this? How had I not seen it coming? The memories came rushing in, each one now tinged with suspicion. The late nights at the office, the new cologne he'd started wearing, the credit card charges he claimed were for work expenses. I'd ignored it all, told myself I was overthinking. But now, sitting there in the silence of my car, I realized the truth. I'd married a stranger. My phone buzzed again. For a fleeting moment, I thought maybe Patrick had sent another message, an explanation, an apology. But it was my mom. "Hey, Em. Just checking in. Call me when you can. Love you." The tears I'd been holding back finally spilled over. I hit call, and as soon as her voice came through the line, I broke. When I walked through the door of our apartment, well, my apartment now, the first thing I noticed was the eerie stillness. No TV blaring in the background, no half-empty coffee mug on the counter, just silence. Patrick's absence was loud in a way I hadn't expected. His shoes weren't by the door. His jacket wasn't on the hook. I checked our bedroom, and sure enough, his side of the closet was empty. Even the stupid golf trophies he insisted on displaying were gone. The only thing he'd left behind was a sticky note on the fridge that read, "Sorry. Take care." Sorry? That was it? A post-it note apology? I yanked it off the fridge and crumpled it in my hand, feeling my anger bubble up. Sorry didn't cover the fact that he'd just detonated my life like it was nothing. Sorry didn't put money back in my account or explain why I'd spent 5 years building a life with someone who could walk away so easily. I sat on the couch, surrounded by the ghost of our life together, and let the anger simmer. Then I started calling people. First, our mutual friends. No one had heard from him. Most of them sounded genuinely shocked, but a few seemed awkward, like they knew more than they were letting on. My stomach churned at the thought. Then I called his parents. His mom was as clueless as I was, but his dad's silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. He muttered something about Patrick needing time to figure things out before hanging up abruptly. I stared at the phone, feeling like I was piecing together a puzzle with half the pieces missing. By the time I reached my mom, I was running on fumes. She answered on the first ring. "Emma, what's wrong?" Her voice was sharp with concern, and for the second time that day I broke down. Between sobs, I told her everything. The text, the money, the empty apartment. She listened patiently, occasionally muttering words like, "that bastard," under her breath. When I finally finished, she said, "Pack your bags, you're coming home." "Mom," I can't just... Emma Louise Harper, she said, in the tone that meant she wasn't taking no for an answer. You're not staying in that apartment, moping around and eating microwave dinners. Come home. Let me take care of you for a while. The thought of going back to my childhood home felt like admitting defeat. But what choice did I have? My job barely paid enough to cover rent, and with our account drained, I was out of options. Besides, the idea of facing Patrick's betrayal alone was unbearable. Okay, I whispered. I'll come home. Good, she said. And don't worry, we'll figure this out together. I hung up, feeling a small sliver of relief. At least I wasn't entirely alone. But as I packed my bags, the anger returned. Patrick thought he could walk away unscathed, that I'd just roll over and let him get away with it. He had no idea what was coming. Moving back home felt like stepping into a time machine. My mom hadn't changed a thing about the house since I'd moved out after college. The same floral wallpaper adorned the living room, and the same creaky staircase announced my every move. Even my old bedroom was frozen in time, complete with the mismatched furniture and a poster of a boy band I no longer remembered liking. It's not much, but it's home, Mom said as I dragged my suitcase up the stairs. It's perfect, I said, and I meant it. After the chaos of the past few days, the familiarity was comforting. I spent the first night curled up in my old bed, surrounded by the relics of a simpler time, and for the first time in days I slept soundly. The next morning, Mom had already made a list of things to do. You need to call the bank about the account, she said over breakfast. And find a good lawyer, not one of those cheap ones from the billboards. I can't afford a lawyer, I said, staring at my coffee cup. We'll figure it out, she said firmly. You're not letting him get away with this. Her determination was contagious. By the end of the day, I'd made progress. A meeting with a lawyer who came highly recommended by one of Mom's friends, and a detailed email to my employer explaining the situation. I even called a locksmith to change the locks on the apartment, just in case Patrick decided to show up unannounced. But as I sat at the kitchen table that evening, going over the financial mess Patrick had left behind, the reality of my situation hit me again. My savings were gone. My credit cards were maxed out, thanks to charges I hadn't made. And I still didn't know where Patrick was or what he was planning to do next. Mom sat down across from me, a cup of tea in her hands. You're stronger than you think, Em, she said. You'll get through this. I nodded, but I wasn't sure I believed her. Not yet. The call came the next morning, just as I was finishing my second cup of coffee. It was from the lawyer, a sharp-tongued woman named Claire, who didn't mince words. We've found something interesting, she said. Patrick's been transferring money into a separate account for months. The trail isn't hard to follow. My stomach twisted. So he's been planning this for a while? It looks that way, Claire said. The good news is we can prove it. That'll help when we take this to court. The thought of facing Patrick in court filled me with dread, but it also gave me a spark of hope. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had a chance to fight back. Claire wasn't done. There's something else. We traced one of the accounts to a property he's renting, an address in the city. It's possible he's staying there. Should I go there? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Absolutely not, Claire said. Let me handle it. We'll subpoena the records if we need to, but I thought you should know. I thanked her and hung up, my mind racing. Patrick had thought he could disappear, but he'd left a trail, and now I had the means to follow it. That evening, as I sat with Mom in the living room, I told her everything Claire had said. She listened quietly, her expression unreadable. What are you going to do? She asked when I finished. I don't know, I admitted, but I'm not giving up. She nodded, her hand resting on mine. Good, because neither am I. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of determination. Patrick might have blindsided me, but he'd underestimated one thing. I wasn't going to let him win. The address Claire had uncovered consumed my thoughts. I couldn't stop picturing Patrick living a new life in that rented property, spending our money as if I'd never existed. It felt like an itch I couldn't scratch. Despite Claire's warning, curiosity gnawed at me, and by the next afternoon, I found myself sitting in my car, parked a block away from the address. The building was unremarkable, a modest, gray stone apartment complex with neatly trimmed hedges and a blue awning over the entrance. It didn't look like the kind of place someone would hide in. But then again, Patrick always did like blending in. I'd promised Claire I wouldn't approach him, and I told myself I wasn't breaking that promise. I wasn't going to knock on the door or make a scene. I just needed to see, to understand, to confirm that he was there. After half an hour of waiting, my patience was rewarded. Patrick stepped out of the building, his unmistakable gait making my stomach churn. He looked different. His suit was sharper, his shoes more polished, and his demeanor more confident than I'd ever seen. He was smiling, too, in a way that made my skin crawl. I snapped a photo with my phone, my hands shaking. Then she appeared. A woman, tall, elegant, and dressed in a fitted red coat, walked out behind him. Patrick offered her his arm, and she took it, laughing at something he said. I watched as they strolled down the street together, looking every bit like a couple in love. The betrayal hit me like a freight train. I couldn't sit there any longer. I started the car and drove away, my vision blurred by tears. The image of them together burned into my mind, but so was the resolve forming in my chest. Patrick wanted to erase me, to rewrite our life like I was a footnote. But I wasn't going to let him. Back at my mom's house, I paced the living room like a caged animal. Mom sat on the couch, watching me with her usual mix of concern and quiet strength. "What did you find out?" she finally asked. I told her everything, the address, Patrick's polished appearance, and the woman in red. She listened intently, her jaw tightening with each detail. "He's not just hiding," I said. "He's living some kind of fantasy life. With her." "So what are you going to do?" Mom asked. I stopped pacing and turned to her, my hands clenched into fists. "I'm going to fight back. I don't know how yet, but I'm not letting him get away with this." Mom nodded, her expression hardening. "Good, because I've been doing some digging of my own." I blinked at her. "What do you mean?" She reached for her laptop on the coffee table and opened a tab she'd bookmarked. "I called an old friend of mine who works in real estate. Turns out, Patrick's been looking into some pretty expensive investments. A condo in the city, a timeshare in Mexico, all purchased in cash." My stomach twisted. "With our money." "Exactly," she said. "But here's the thing. Some of those properties are in both your names." I stared at her, my mind racing. "How is that possible? I never signed anything." "No, but he forged your signature," she said grimly. "Claire's going to love this. It's not just fraud. It's a trail we can use to track every penny he took." Hope stirred in my chest, but it was quickly overshadowed by anger. Patrick had not only betrayed me, he'd implicated me in his schemes. If Claire hadn't uncovered this, I could have been held accountable for debts I didn't even know existed. "We need to move fast," I said. "If he's using my name, who knows what else he's done? He could be opening credit cards, taking out loans." Mom reached out and squeezed my hand. "We'll handle it, Em. You're not alone in this." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I'll call Claire first thing in the morning. We need to build a case and freeze everything he's touched." "And what about the woman?" Mom asked carefully. "The woman." The elegant figure in red who'd laughed at Patrick's jokes and walked arm in arm with him. I clenched my jaw. "She's part of this, whether she knows it or not. But Patrick is the one who owes me answers. I'll deal with him first." Mom gave me a small, approving nod. "That's my girl." That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the plan began to form. Patrick thought he was untouchable, but he'd underestimated me. I wasn't the same woman he'd blindsided with a text message. I was stronger now, sharper. And I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to make sure he never did this to anyone else again. The next morning, Claire didn't bother masking her outrage as I relayed everything my mom and I had uncovered. She leaned forward, her usual calm demeanor replaced with fiery determination. "Forgery, fraud, and embezzlement," she said, jotting notes on a yellow legal pad. "Patrick's practically gift-wrapped a case for us." "I'm ready," I said, trying to ignore the tremor in my voice. "Whatever it takes." Claire glanced up, her expression softening. "Emily, this isn't going to be easy. People like Patrick always have contingencies. He'll try to paint you as the villain, especially since he's already moved on with someone else." Her words stung, but I nodded. "I don't care. I'm not backing down." Claire outlined our strategy: freezing joint accounts, filing charges for forgery, and issuing a subpoena for Patrick's financial records. It sounded clinical on paper, but I knew the execution would be messy. Still, For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had control, like I was steering the ship instead of drowning beneath it. By noon, the legal wheels were in motion. Claire filed the paperwork, while I sent emails to every financial institution Patrick might have touched. Each keystroke was a small act of defiance, a reminder that I wasn't powerless. It didn't take long for Patrick to notice. That evening, my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated before answering, my heart pounding in my chest. Hello? There was a pause, then his voice, smooth, infuriatingly calm. Emily, I see you've been busy. I swallowed hard, forcing steel into my tone. Patrick, surprised you still remember my name. He chuckled, but there was an edge to it. Come on, let's not be dramatic. You've made your point. Now, let's be reasonable. Reasonable? I said, my voice rising. You forged my signature, stole my money, and humiliated me, and you think I'm being unreasonable? Emily, this isn't good for either of us, he said, his tone growing colder. If you keep pushing, it'll get messy. I don't want that, and I'm sure you don't either. I almost laughed at the audacity. Messy? You don't know the meaning of the word. But don't worry, Patrick, you will. Before he could respond, I hung up, my hands shaking. I wanted to cry, scream, and throw something all at once, but I couldn't. The tension from my call with Patrick lingered well into the night. Every noise outside my window felt like a threat. Every shadow seemed to carry his manipulative voice. But I refused to let fear consume me. Instead, I funneled that energy into action, diving into every file, every email, and every memory I had of Patrick's financial dealings. If he wanted a fight, I would give him one. The next morning, a knock on the door startled me. I glanced at my mom, who raised an eyebrow from her spot at the kitchen table. She silently got up, peered through the peephole, and opened the door cautiously. A tall man in a navy suit stood there, his posture formal but non-threatening. Mrs. Dawson, he asked, his voice calm but firm. I stepped forward. That's me. Who are you? He extended a business card, and my stomach tightened as I read the bold black print. William Chase, private investigator. I believe we need to talk, he said, his expression unreadable. It's about Patrick. I hesitated, then stepped aside to let him in. Once he was seated, he pulled out a sleek black folder and placed it on the coffee table. Who sent you? I asked, my voice cautious. Let's just say I have a professional interest in cases like yours. Patrick Dawson has a track record, and you're not the first person he's left blindsided. The air left my lungs. What do you mean, track record? William opened the folder, revealing a stack of photos, documents, and printed emails. Patrick's been running scams like this for years, targeting women, draining their resources, and moving on to the next mark. He's good at staying under the radar, but he's gotten careless recently. I leaned forward, my hands trembling as I flipped through the documents. Each page painted a picture of a man I barely recognized. Fake business ventures, offshore accounts, and even another ex-wife I'd never known about. Why are you helping me? I asked, looking up at him. William's expression softened. Because people like Patrick need to be stopped, and because someone close to me was one of his victims. His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pain. I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his sincerity. What do you need from me? I asked. Your cooperation, he said, and your story. If we can connect the dots between his past crimes and what he's done to you, we'll have enough to bring him down. But it won't be easy. Patrick's smart, and he won't go down without a fight. I glanced at my mom, who gave me an encouraging nod. I'm in, I said, my voice steady. Whatever it takes. William smiled faintly. Good, then let's get to work. That evening, as I combed through the evidence with William, I began to piece together a clearer picture of the man I'd married. He wasn't just a liar or a cheat. He was a predator, preying on the trust and vulnerability of the people who loved him. One document in particular caught my eye, a financial transaction tied to an offshore account. The amount was staggering, and it had been transferred just days before he'd sent me that devastating text message. This account, I said, pointing to the screen. Can we trace it? William nodded. I've already started. If we can prove it's tied to your joint account, it'll be a key piece of evidence. The thought of Patrick sitting in his rented apartment, smug and untouchable, fueled my determination. He thought he could outrun his past, but he didn't realize how many people he'd wronged and how ready I was to stand with them. As William left that night, he handed me a small flash drive. "This contains everything I've found so far," he said. "Keep it safe and don't let Patrick know we're onto him." I nodded, clutching the drive tightly. "Thank you." He paused, then added, "You're stronger than you think, Emily. Don't let him make you doubt that." After he left, I sat alone in the living room, the flash drive resting in my palm. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't fighting this battle alone. Patrick had underestimated me, but he'd also underestimated the power of those he'd wronged. The storm was coming, and this time, I wasn't the one who'd be blindsided. With William's evidence and Claire's legal expertise, we began closing in on Patrick's schemes. The flash drive revealed more than just financial fraud. It exposed a web of deceit connecting Patrick to multiple women, all of whom had suffered similar fates. Claire contacted the other victims, convincing them to join forces in what was quickly becoming a powerful case. Meanwhile, I faced the challenge of confronting Patrick directly. Claire suggested we wait until everything was legally airtight, but I couldn't. I needed answers, not just for myself, but for every woman he'd wronged. I found myself at the gray stone apartment building again, this time determined to speak to him face to face. Armed with copies of the evidence, I knocked on the door. When Patrick opened it, his smirk vanished the moment he saw me. "Emily," he said, his voice laced with forced charm. "This is a surprise." "Cut the act," I snapped, stepping inside before he could shut the door. His new girlfriend stood in the kitchen, watching us with wary eyes. I held up the folder. "I know everything, Patrick. The offshore accounts, the forged signatures, the other women. It's over." His face paled, but he quickly recovered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You don't understand the full picture." "Oh, I understand perfectly," I shot back. "You're a thief, a liar, and a fraud, and you're going to pay for everything you've done." Before he could respond, his girlfriend stepped forward, her expression shifting from confusion to fury. "What is she talking about, Patrick?" he stammered, but I didn't stick around to hear his excuses. I left the apartment with my head held high, knowing the walls of his deception were finally closing in. The legal proceedings began in earnest. Claire filed charges on behalf of me and the other women, and William worked tirelessly to track down Patrick's hidden assets. The case gained traction in the media, painting Patrick as a con artist who preyed on women's trust. Patrick, of course, tried to fight back. He hired a high-powered attorney and spun a sob story about how he'd been misunderstood and unfairly targeted. But the evidence against him was overwhelming, and for every lie he told, there were multiple women ready to testify to the truth. The trial became a public spectacle, and I found myself at the center of it all. Reporters camped outside my mom's house, and every day brought new headlines dissecting the case. It was exhausting, but I refused to let it break me. The day of the verdict arrived, and the courtroom was packed. I sat in the front row with Claire and William by my side, my heart pounding as the judge read the charges against Patrick. Guilty. The word echoed in my ears, and relief washed over me like a tidal wave. Patrick was sentenced to several years in prison, his assets seized to repay his victims. It wasn't just justice, it was vindication. After the trial, I stood outside the courthouse, surrounded by reporters. They bombarded me with questions, but I focused on the women who had stood with me throughout this ordeal. Together, we had taken down a man who thought he was untouchable. With Patrick behind bars, life slowly began to return to normal. I started a new job and moved into a small but cozy apartment, determined to rebuild the life he had tried to destroy. But the experience had changed me. I was no longer the naive woman who had once trusted him implicitly. I was stronger, wiser, and ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Claire and William remained close friends, and we often talked about using the publicity from the case to help other victims of financial abuse. It wasn't just about Patrick anymore. It was about creating a legacy of empowerment and resilience. Months later, as I walked through the park on a crisp autumn morning, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The weight of Patrick's betrayal was finally lifting, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. A man approached me, his smile warm and genuine. We struck up a conversation, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope for the future. Patrick had tried to break me, but he hadn't succeeded. I was still standing, stronger than ever, ready to embrace whatever came next.